Welcome everybody to the Tribal Wildlife Grant Writing Strategy Webinar. My name is Josh Simmons and I am the Principal Consultant and Attorney for Prosper Sustainably. And this is actually the third Grant Writing Strategy webinar I've hosted in the past 2 weeks. So you all are fortunate. I think I've worked out most of the kinks on this, and as we get a little further in, I'm going to give a little bit of advice in terms of hopefully getting the best experience in terms of participating in this webinar. So just so you know a bit about me, I'm the founding president of Prosper Sustainably. I started this company a couple months ago, and the main goal is to assist tribal communities in developing and implementing lasting solutions to meet their environmental and sustainability needs. I've listed a couple of the different service offerings I have right there. I was the director of the Santa Ynez Chumash Environmental Office from 2007 to 2014. During that time, I was able to transform the Chumash into their environmental agency into one of the leading in the country through a lot of the similar types of efforts or services that I'm offering now to other tribes. And also during that time was able to secure 42 grants from a variety of federal agencies, state agencies, and nonprofit foundations for $4.3 million. And I am also a grant writing instructor. I have taught different grant writing courses and workshops on behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, and I also taught 2 grant writing courses at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm working on the third right now. So the lawyer in me requires me to share the following disclaimer. I want to make sure everybody understands that this webinar is sponsored by Prosper Sustainably, which is a for-profit business that assists tribal communities and other organizations develop and implement lasting solutions to meet environmental and sustainability needs. This webinar is not sponsored or endorsed by the Fish and Wildlife Service and shouldn't be considered a representation of their opinions in any way. So I just want to make sure that I don't upset anybody over at the Fish and Wildlife Service, and just so that's clear for everybody that I'm presenting this from the perspective of a grant writer who has experience writing Fish and Wildlife Service, tribal wildlife grants, and a variety of other grants for federal agencies. So before we do a little more of an orientation, I just want to provide the objectives for everybody so we have a roadmap of where we're going. And I apologize, this is a somewhat text-heavy webinar, but I think that if you are seriously considering applying for this funding opportunity, and I'm assuming that anybody here is, then I think that the information will be valuable to all of you. In fact, I think last year 122 tribes applied, so I think we only had about 15 to 20 people register for this webinar, and I'm hoping that I'll provide you all with a competitive advantage. So I want to teach the grant writing review process, not just for this opportunity, but so you can apply to other grant opportunities as well. I'm going to share with you the grant review documents, so I will provide a copy of this presentation. I will email it to you along with a copy of the template that I'm going to use, a blank template that you can use for this grant opportunity or for other funding opportunities. And I will also forward along the example review, which we're going to go through a bit further on. That's going to be it's going to be the grant review template applied to the tribal wildlife grant, current tribal wildlife grant opportunity, so that we'll be going through the Fish and Wildlife Service tribal wildlife grant funding documents. Hopefully this will help you determine whether you want to apply for the grant or not. That's always an important consideration. Writing grant proposals takes time, takes personnel resources, and it's really important for you to determine early on whether it's an appropriate opportunity for you to apply for or not. And also to help you consider your strategy in preparing your application. My other objectives are to build awareness among tribes and people who work with tribes about Prosper prosper sustainably services and expertise. Connect with those interested in these types of opportunities and hopefully help more valuable projects get successfully completed. I chose to go into the consulting realm so that I could help other tribes accomplish similar success or achieve similar success to what I was able to accomplish with the Chumash. And I'm also asking that at the end of the presentation, if you can complete the post-webinar survey to provide feedback. The feedback itself is very valuable. I received feedback from the last two presentations that allowed this one to be, hopefully will make this one that much better. I want to continue to improve the service offering, so I want to continue to offer free webinars that are going to help you all decide whether and how to pursue these opportunities. And some of them may have to do with the content, but I especially would like your feedback in terms of whether there are any issues with the webinar itself. So this is a listen-only webinar. If you have questions, please enter them into the lower left corner of the screen. I will review those questions and answer them at the end of the presentation. I recommend calling in rather than listening through your computer. Based on some of the feedback that I received, people, if you're listening through your computer, my voice may cut in and out. In fact, I presented through my computer in the first webinar and I cut in and out, so that's a problem. So if you have the ability to, I recommend calling back in. I think you'll still have enough time to do that in time for getting to really kind of the meat of the webinar with the focus on the Tribal Wildlife Grant. I also recommend closing other programs, especially those that are internet-based, to improve your internet connection. So you're essentially streaming this webinar through your internet connection, and the more open you keep your bandwidth, the better. And if you have any problems, I recommend that you go to the anymeeting.com support page. So go to anymeeting.com and click on support. There is an option to test your computer for compatibility, and there's also further down you can test your connection to make sure you don't have a firewall blocking it. And there's also a troubleshooting guide on there as well. And if you do have problems with the webinar itself through any meeting, please let me know, because if you let me know what you experienced and how, whether you were listening through your computer or through over the phone, then I can actually help provide guidance for people in the future as well. And I provided an email to you beforehand that kind of talked about some of these things and provides links to the troubleshooting guide. So this picture right here is a picture of the Zena Dakota Creek, which is within the Santa Ynez Indian Reservation. And so when I was overseeing the Santa Ynez Chumash Environmental Office, we applied for 6 tribal wildlife grants. We were awarded funds on the first and the last proposal, which essentially bookended my career with the Chumash Environmental Office. So I had 2 successful proposals in the beginning and the end. I believe the first one I applied for was in 2008, and then the last one, which we just got notified for, or the tribe got notified for, was in 2013 when the proposal was submitted. So even though this is the fiscal year 2015 proposal, I'm referring to this as being submitted in 2014. So all the unsuccessful proposals in between were focused on trying to create a native and cultural plant nursery. And so, something I learned over time is while I may have kind of an objective, and it's difficult to get funding for a native and cultural plant nursery, I think I submitted some very good proposals, but I essentially was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So while I believe it was a good, sound project, it didn't really line up with the criteria for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And, after several attempts, we, tweaking it each year, feeling like we were addressing the needs of the Fish and Wildlife Service more and more, we almost shifted gears completely and were then awarded again the past year. So the 2008 proposal was focused on habitat and wildlife inventories and assessments, and also developing a Chumash wildlands management plan. And it was a comprehensive management plan that covered the Chumash Reservation, which is about 140 acres. So in comparison to some reservations, that's fairly small. The 2013 proposal was focused on invasive species survey, mapping, management, and restoration, which was more of an update than anything else because some of this had been conducted under the prior tribal wildlife grant and other grant programs that were operated through the environmental office. Also to establish a series of cultural plant gathering sites and for management of those sites, including training of seed gathering, propagation, plant management, and cultivation. That component turned out to be the alternative to the cultural plant nursery that we were seeking in the beginning because it does involve involves going out and gathering seed, propagating those seed, and then planting those seeds at these gathering sites. So while wasn't the full-on cultural native plant nursery we envisioned, which we were hoping to address this need for cultural plants for the tribal community, but also to propagate plants for habitat restoration and even landscaping, native plant landscaping. This is an alternative way it's actually a step in the right direction. The 2013 proposal also included habitat protection ordinance, especially riparian buffers. You'll notice on the sides. Let me just kind of orient you a little bit. The Santa Ynez Chumash Indian Reservation is located in Santa Barbara County, California, which is central California, maybe more southern California. The Xana Dakota Creek is a perennial creek that runs through the reservation. It is fed by groundwater. It flows pretty good year-round. Right now, with the drought we're experiencing, it does tend to go. It's not contiguous. It does go beneath ground and then resurface in different areas. But it's a valuable resource for the Chumash. Perennial creeks are fairly rare in Southern California, and so protecting this resource, having the riparian habitat buffer zones and stuff like that are essential to the ongoing health. And we will be the tribe has been looking into reintroducing steelhead and other cultural resources onto the reservation. So the entire reservation itself runs along the creek itself. It's a little more of a long and narrow reservation. The fiscal year 2000 or the 2008 TWG proposal, and I will refer to the Tribal Wildlife Grant as TWG from time to time, also involved updating the Chumash Wildlands Management Plan. So that was was the objective of the 2008 proposal. So this is an update. It's actually going to incorporate some FEDA trust lands that the tribe has been working on. So there are two separate parcels that were not encompassed in the original scope of the Wildlands Management Plan. And the last component is community education outreach, which ties back to all the other components. And every proposal itself is going to have a component for administration and reporting. Okay, so grant writing steps. In the grant writing courses I have instructed in the past, I provide a blueprint for preparing grant proposals. And during this webinar, we are going to focus on the step that you see right now, which is pulsing, and that is reviewing the funding announcement. The funding announcement could be called the RFP, it could be called the application package. There's different names for it. Essentially, it's usually a document, or it might be multiple documents that describe the steps required and the guidelines for applying for a particular funding opportunity. So you may be wondering what exactly is a grant announcement review. I'm going to briefly go through the different elements of the grant announcement review document and process, which should help inform you what exactly it is. And then afterwards, after explaining why you go through it, then we will apply this grant announcement review process to the TWG opportunity. So the grant announcement review is a document, a process that I developed that helps me avoid, or anybody avoid, missing critical information. So This information is summarized in a way that allows you to then extract it on a later date or a later time more quickly and easily. And so the first top of the document is the funding announcement, the funding opportunity and title identifiers. So the opportunity title itself may need to be included in your proposal somewhere. And the identifiers may be things like the Code of Federal Regulations or the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance number or the application number. It's good to make note of the funding opportunity announcement and website links so you can come back to those when you need to, as opposed to having to go back and do a Google search or go through your emails to find an email where it was announced. The eligible organizations and locations, and you want to make sure that you are an eligible organization. You're proposing projects for eligible locations. You'll want to include the eligible activities. If there are any cost sharing or matching requirements for the proposal or the application. Very critical to know the application deadline. To know the application submission options. This may be email, it may be mailing, it may be grants.gov. Luckily in this case it's not grants.gov. That can take some time. The application contact and assistance. So the contact information for, if there is one for the application process, and if there's additional contact information for assistance in preparing the proposal or for getting other feedback. The format requirements for the proposal, such as how many pages or the fonts or size of the fonts. The funding period, the length, the start, and the end. Available funding, it's always good to know how much money is available, how many awards are anticipated, what's the minimum and maximum amounts that's available. If there are any specific proposal requirements or restrictions, not just proposal requirements or restrictions, but also project requirements or restrictions. The required proposal components, so this is essentially the outline. This is going to be all the key ingredients to the proposal and the application that you're going to be submitting. The project proposal criteria, and that's what your proposal is going to be ranked upon. The list of priority tasks, so during this process you want to identify what are the tasks that you need to do right now, or you need to be thinking about right now. A lot of times these involve signatures, such as if you need one from the tribal chairperson. Any additional notes, things that you want to make note of that were not covered in the sections above. Questions you may have that you can ask that key contact information or the key contact person for the proposal. And then as you're going through it, you may already have some specific project ideas in mind, but when you go through and see what the eligible activities are, you may find that you did not list some of these, and there would actually be good ideas for your community. So listing those specific project ideas. So now I want to focus on why you go through the grant announcement review process. The grant announcement review process helps you extract the most important information and to avoid missing critical information. So, it's sometimes these grants, RFPs are very lengthy. They can be upwards of 60, 70 pages long. And it's easy not only to miss information, but you may go through the entire document, and if you don't actually record the most critical information, you're going to forget. When I think initially about applying for a grant opportunity, I usually do not apply for it until maybe several weeks after I actually review the opportunity itself. So during those several weeks, I'm going to forget things like the deadline. There have been instances in the past, and I've written 40-something proposals, and I've learned a lot along the way. There's times where I remember what the deadline was. I remembered it was due by 5 o'clock, but before I went through this process, I would sometimes forget that it was Eastern time, and I'm located in California. There have been instances where I've tried to submit a proposal at 5 p.m. Pacific time or before 5 p.m. Pacific time, and it was actually due in Eastern time. There have been instances where that's actually still been accepted, and it's taken a bit of pleading and negotiating and maybe some other lame excuses. But you don't really want to come to that point because they can just say, well, tough luck. And usually, especially if you submit through grants.gov, it just may be hard and fast. If you miss that deadline, then you're up a creek without a paddle. So it also is good for you to determine whether or not you want to prepare a grant proposal. I often have, in the past with the CHUMASH, as director, if I'm writing a proposal, I also have to oversee all the other programs, and we've scaled up to 20 something programs. I tend to put them off toward the latter half or closer to the deadline. I usually do. That's not ideal, so obviously you don't want to do that, but we all have a lot going on, and a lot of us also don't operate well unless we have a deadline looming. So you want to determine early on, you don't want to be going through the process of preparing the proposal itself and start filling it out, and then you get to a certain point and realize, this is actually just not a good idea. This doesn't make sense for us. It requires too much information. For example, last year I was considering the Department of Energy Tribal Energy Program funding opportunity. I went through the review process and found out that we were going to have to submit all of the financial information from the tribal government side of things, which would have included all of its commercial operations as well. And I, without even really asking anybody, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to provide that information. So that was essentially a proposal killer. Now, if I hadn't actually done the review process beforehand and completed the whole grant proposal, or at least most of it, and then came across the information when I was putting it all together, I would have wasted a whole bunch of time and came to the point where I realized that I can't submit this proposal, or I'm going to submit it with a key piece of information missing. It helps you scan and summarize a potentially lengthy document. The Tribal Wildlife Grant is fairly short compared to some RFPs, so it's only 12 pages, but there are other additional documents. So it's still even good to summarize that. It's good to go through the process of reviewing it to make sure you're catching the key information and putting in an even shorter document. But if it's a 70-page document, this is critical. I mean, there's no way, you don't want to have to keep referring back to a 70-page document for the requirements. It helps you identify the proposal requirements, components, and criteria. Through this process, you're able to prepare a proposal outline and a checklist. So you'll refer back to the outline itself, and that'll help you in crafting your proposal and making sure that it's organized. And then this also includes a checklist, so you can come back to it and make sure you have actually included and addressed everything. That ties into preparing a strategy for your grant proposal itself. It'll help you determine what information you're going to need to gather, identify those tasks that you're going to need to get on right away, especially those that are time sensitive or may involve signatures. Helps you identify deliverables that are going to involve other people or organizations. If you're looking at letters of support from outside organizations, you're going to want to identify those organizations and make contact with them early on. And not just considering your own signatures from your tribal chairperson, but if you're talking to a nonprofit, you may need to get a resolution or signature from their president, their executive director, or their board of directors. And so that may take them some time, so you want to start doing that right away, get that ball rolling. Also, you're going to have to allocate people, time, and other resources toward this. So you want to be able to consider who and how much time and resources that's going to take. And through this process, you'll identify proposal questions and who to ask and how to ask. Sometimes you can't just call somebody up and ask them. Sometimes you need to submit it via email, or there may be a specific website you need to submit it through, and you may only be able to submit questions that will then get posted to an FAQ that are available to everybody. All right, so now I'm going to go through the Tribal Wildlife Grant funding opportunity. So let me just find the document. And then, if anybody's having any issues with hearing me for some reason, if I'm too loud, if you hear any background noise, please let me know. If I'm cutting in and out, then that may be a connection on your side, and I do recommend trying to connect over the phone. So one second while I grab that document and pull it over to the screen. Okay, so here is the review document. And the template itself that I'm going to provide is actually going to have this information, but it will not, I'm going to provide a template that has this information deleted in a Word format so that you can use it for future grant applications. But I'll also provide a copy of this as well. And something I want to reiterate before I jump into this is that I'm reviewing it from the perspective of a grant writer and instructor. I didn't complete this form with any specific projects or opportunities in mind. You should only pull out, when you're doing this process, you should only pull out the information that's from the RFP or other funding announcement documents that are relevant to you and your situation. When you do it, the review document will likely end up being much shorter. So since I took more of a general approach, I cut and paste a lot of broader information into the proposal or into this review template. And I also want to say that there may be other information and documents that are relevant to your tribe or situation that I did not make note of in here. So make sure you can use this document that I can provide as a starting point. You can cut and paste it, but make sure you go back through the RFP, at least scan it, make sure there's nothing that's particularly relevant to you, any restrictions, any requirements. This process is for starting off. It's not comprehensive necessarily. So go through it and make sure that this document's custom tailored to meet your tribe's unique circumstances, needs, and objectives. And the fact that you will have this that's already partially completed should actually help the review process go much quicker than doing it from scratch. All right, also let me know if it's not large enough for you as well. Any of the documents I pull up, just make sure that you can see them. If you can't, just message me and I'll make sure I zoom in more. All right, so again, this is the Fish and Wildlife Tribal Wildlife Grant Opportunity. The title itself was just Tribal Wildlife Grants, I suppose. The website, this is the website. I believe I received an announcement through an email. That's how I found this. When I teach the grant writing courses, there's different ways to make sure you're informed of grant opportunities. The best way I found is just to make sure on people's email lists, and that usually isn't a problem. I find that most people who are on tribal email lists, that they get informed about these opportunities pretty regularly. So actually, let me just go to the website just to show you what it looks like and where it's at. So I'll pull it over, zoom in a little more. So here's the website itself. Here's the application kit. There's a couple other documents on here as well. It's good to just review this. This is more of a summary, and it has some of the other documents and things that I'm going to refer to moving forward. Nope, I'm not trying to move that. Okay. So it's good to make note of what relevant proposal guidance documents there are. The main thing I'm focusing on is the TWG application kit, and I guess bringing this screen back over, that's this right here, the main document itself. But there's also a format recommendations separate document that is editable. This is within the actual kit itself, but taking this and opening this, that actually may serve as your template for your proposal. So that's one thing, that's why they provided it to you. The SF424, a sample proposal, which is right here, and then past summaries of past grants that the Fish and Wildlife Service has awarded, which is a useful reference. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So those I made note of those. You may choose to or may choose not to. So again, this process is for you and yourself. This is how I go through it, but you custom tailor to what best meets your needs. Just make sure you're not setting yourself up to miss critical information. I always make note of the eligible organizations' locations. This isn't really something you have to make note of, but you do want to make sure you're not applying for something that tribes aren't eligible for, or that you're not applying for something that's on an ineligible location. So in this instance, federally recognized tribes listed in the BIA annual tribal leaders directory, and they had a link to that, or they referred to where that's at. They did say other organizations and entities may participate as subgrantees or contractors to federally recognized tribes. So one thing to note is that projects may be proposed on lands other than those held in tribal trust status. So for the Chumash in the prior proposal there, this was applicable because we wanted to consider those fee to trust lands. That one of them is actually where the source spring of the Xanadu Dakota Creek is. So it's right across Highway 246 on the north side of the reservation. And so being able to apply this to that piece of property is useful. And then there's another separate, very large property. It's 1,400 acres that the tribe is trying to convert into trust right now. And so, knowing that we can apply that to here as well. They do note that it doesn't have to be on fee to trust land. It can be on just straight up fee land, or it can be on land owned by somebody else. But they do note in the RFP that you need to have the approval of the person to apply whatever projects or tasks that you're going to be doing on that other piece of property. And so that's always good to know, because in some instances it may be limited to trust lands. So eligible activities, and again, this is where I just cut and pasted what was in the grant announcement. So if I were you, I would look at this document and I would just, if something's not applicable, if you're not proposing anything to do with water, just delete the fish passage, or just only include what's relevant to you here. It's good to go through this because, like I said, you may come up, you may not have considered a habitat mapping or evaluation component to the project you were thinking of, and then you saw it's an eligible activity right here, and so you want to make note of that because you may consider doing that as well. I'm not going to go through all the specifics related to this grant opportunity. It's pretty straightforward in terms of what's eligible and what's not, and there is additional context information in terms of what types of projects. I mentioned some that the Chumash were doing. I think really studies, plans, restoration projects, those are often probably the most usual typical projects, but it's okay to think outside the box. But I recommend proposing whatever you're doing or talking with your local liaison. I'm going to get to that in a moment as well. Okay, so cost share. There's no cost share required, but if you do propose matching funds, it may increase your score. So when we go through the criteria, you'll see that it's the approach that I've taken a lot of times is, while cost share is not required, I don't want to miss out on those points, and it can be difficult to get your tribe or another entity to commit to some type of match. But if you are not requesting indirect costs through this proposal, and I don't recall actually whether the indirect costs were eligible or not, but you can propose them as a match, and that's what I've done in all of my TWG proposals, and receive points for proposing the indirect cost as a match. So your tribe will need an indirect cost rate agreement, and you'll need to provide that as part of your proposal or at some later time. The application deadline. So applications are due September 2nd, 2014, but they only need to be postmarked on September 2nd. I've submitted these usually by FedEx. I'll usually submit them overnight. It's usually been on the deadline in the past when they've been submitted. And in the beginning, I wrote most of these proposals myself, but then over time, I delegated most of them to staff and really just oversaw the overall framework of the proposal, the objectives, and what the work plan was going to involve. So, that's good. It gives you a little more time. It's different than if it needs to be received by September 2nd. So just make sure that if you're bringing it to U.S. Postal Service, make sure they postmark it that day. If you bring it to FedEx, make sure they somehow indicate that you submitted it to them by September 2nd, that's included on the package that then gets received by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the options, you can submit a hard copy. So you want to make sure, one thing, this is where going through this process is important. You may just jump and like, okay, well, I got to just make sure I get my copy in, get the original submitted. So they want one original and 3 copies if you're going to submit a hard copy proposal. And it goes to your regional NAL, and the NAL is the Native American Liaison, the Fish and Wildlife Service Native American Liaison from Table 1. That's on page 8 of the proposal. So let me just actually pull up that proposal so you guys can see what it looks like. Let me shrink it down a little bit. Oh, sorry if that's a little bit small. So this is the kit itself. It's 13 pages. The table for all the liaisons is, I mentioned page 8. That's right here. It's also on the website as well. So this is when I'm referring to these page numbers. So when I go through this process, I also include the page numbers of where I found relevant information, and all of those page numbers refer to that main Tribal Wildlife Grants application kit. And then if I refer to a different document, I indicate that other document where that's located as well. Just so when I pick this up a few weeks later, I know exactly where to go to find it. I don't have to go sifting through this information. It really saves you a lot of time. You can email an electronic copy, but you still do need to submit a signed original hard copy. I usually do this. I'll email an electronic copy to I believe it's the Region 8 contact for California, and that's Damian Ciotti. But also the original hard copy still needs to be mailed with a postmark by September 2nd. Another alternative is that you can mail an electronic copy, which is a disc, but you still do need to include the signed hard copy. They want a wet signature on the letter, the resolution we're going to talk about in a moment, and also the SF424. The contacts, there's a regional the regional contact list, and then there's also a national contact they provided as well within the application itself. So they do mention that the liaisons are willing to talk with you about this, so I highly recommend reaching out to them and just talking about what you're thinking about doing. As you go through this process, have a list of questions. If you have any, make sure you ask those, but just mention what you're planning on proposing, to do, and you mention what the application, the work plan is going to include, or you're thinking it may include, and just they may provide a little bit of feedback, and that's huge, because a lot of times you can't do that. Some agencies will not talk to you about the proposal content itself. They'll only talk to you about the application process. So take advantage of that. Make sure you're not, that you may have a project in mind you're excited about, you think is a good idea. You talk to them and they're like, yeah, well, that's kind of things like that have been submitted in the past, and it just doesn't get highly ranked. So you want to make sure you do that. And I always do reach out ahead of time, talk with, it's been Damien. We've had a couple different ones in the past. I actually, the first one was David Wooten, who now works for the BIA. I've always talked to them about it beforehand and just kind of get a general sense, let them know what I'm proposing. So it's just, they're going to be involved in the review process to a certain extent too. Helps you establish a relationship, and you get to introduce yourself to the person you're going to be working with if you do get funded as well. So you want to make note of the format requirements. It does have a 24-page limit, and it just doesn't provide anything beyond in terms of fonts. It just says reasonably readable font size, style, and size. They are very specific in terms of, make sure you're using a staple in the upper left hand corner. You're probably not going to get your proposal rejected if you miss something like this, but the funders are going to, the ones who are particularly particular are going to make note of just you not following simple instructions. They may or may not. They're not going to probably knock any points off of it, but it may affect their overall impression of the proposal. For electronic submissions, they say use Word or WordPerfect. I have submitted PDFs in the past, which is usually easy, but they want a single file. So if you submit them via email or in a CD or DVD, make sure that the documents are all in one file. And I did mention that editable Word version of the format requirements that you can actually use as the template for your proposal. The funding period, it's not specified. It just says the shortest duration necessary with available extensions as necessary. I would talk to the grant project officer about this. So if you have something in mind, I would talk to your local Native American liaison about this, because you may not really, you may think that it's okay. It may take you 3 years to prepare a wildlands management plan, and that may be realistic for you in your situation, but the funders may not, the people reviewing it may not think that's reasonable. And so I'm not saying whether that is not reasonable. I mean, usually if you are proposing a plan, 1 year is usually the most you'd want to propose. But talk to them and see what they say or what they think is reasonable. Usually, I think if you're kind of thinking a 1 to 2 year project, you should be safe. The available funding is a little over $4 million. There's no minimum, although they do say that if it's $25,000 or $30,000 or less, or if it's less than $25,000 or $30,000, the administrative burden is disproportionately high. So I'm reading that to say don't submit anything lower than 25. In fact, don't submit anything less than 30. The maximum is $200,000. I forgot to make note of whether multiple proposals can be submitted or not. So if you are considering multiple proposals, in the past I've read that you can submit multiple proposals, but those proposals should not, if you cannot get awarded more than $200,000 between all those proposals. Typically, I think it's not worth submitting multiple proposals unless you have like a wild card objective. So let's say you have some safe objectives you think are reasonable and you think are highly likely to get funded, but there's really one thing that you'd really love to get funded but you think is risky. It may be worth submitting a separate proposal for it if it's allowed, just so you don't risk losing out on what you think is a relatively safe proposal. They're expecting 100 to 130 proposals. Last year they received 122 that were proposed for $21.3 million, and they only ended up awarding 25. So it is a fairly competitive. About 1 in 5 submissions are getting awarded. And that's something that you want to consider. If this is 25 awards out of 122, I think that gives you 20% a reasonable shot. The cream will rise to the top if you have a particularly good project. I've learned that with the Chumash, I write very good proposals, but it's really, you have to have good projects. With the Chumash, having relatively small or a relatively low amount of tribal lands, 140 acres, can be more difficult. Sometimes this isn't quite as competitive versus the tribes who have thousands of acres or even hundreds or thousands of square miles. Really, one of the criteria is resource benefit, and when you only have 140 square acres, that is, you're going to have a much lower impact. Likely, your impact may be lower than a tribe that's larger. At the same time, we've received 2 awards out of the 6 proposals, so it's still there. Don't, just because you have a small tribe, don't necessarily count yourself out. Just realize that it's competitive and evaluate that in deciding whether or not to spend the time on a proposal. The requirements and restrictions I made note of, this is just a few things I made note of. You want to still kind of skim the application or the documents to make sure. there's nothing else applicable to you, your tribe, or your location. So they cannot be used to conduct activities to comply with biological opinions or with permits. There are administrative requirements, which are just typically, kind of the Code of Federal Regulations or the OMB circular type stuff. One thing I made note of, which isn't really a requirement or restriction, is that proposals no longer have to address climate change. And I think for the past few years, they've required a section of the document that, it's not so much that the proposal, the project needed to address climate change. The proposal itself just needed to have a brief discussion about climate change and how it related. So that's no longer a requirement, which is, I suppose, nice. Okay, so the required proposal components, and this is your outline. This is really your checklist of what needs to be submitted. A cover page. The cover page itself has very specific requirements, and I'll just kind of jump back to that real quick. It's on page 9. So they want this information in the upper right-hand corner of the cover page. So just make sure you do follow those basic formatting requirements. They say an index, which I read to mean a table of contents. They also want a cover letter. Make sure that you understand that the cover letter they require is different from the cover page. Refer to the example that they provide. They do have the proposal example from their website you can download, and that'll show you what the cover letter itself looks like. I think the latest one we submitted, I think this is probably the first time I noticed that. So I believe that the Chumash have submitted 6 proposals that did not include a cover letter, although it's basic information, and it was more of an oversight on our part. Or just really, the only reason I know that there is a difference between the two is because I went and looked at that sample where I guess I missed it before. Although I did not conduct this review, I had staff conduct this review for the past couple times we've done this. So, make note of that. Just copy and paste it for the most part, and just change the names or change your general objectives and circumstances. A project summary, no more than a half page, and that'll probably be somewhat redundant from what the information is in your cover letter. The project narrative, there are the assessment of needs, objectives, your proposed timeline, and they say, a table or a Gantt chart. The methodology, geographical locations, maps can be optional. I suggest including maps in there to just make the proposal look better, and it gives you a better sense of where things are located. And you can also include a narrative. The number of impacted acres and or miles of stream or shoreline. And for this, one thing I want to say is, you may be talking about restoration for, let's say you're proposing restoration for 200 yards of stream. The number of impacted acres or miles of stream is not necessarily limited to those 200 acres. So if you're actually doing improvements, you're also going to be positively impacting I would say the wildlife corridor, the riparian zone around it. So I would include that in terms of what you're impacting. And also anything downstream is going to be positively impacted as well. So make sure you make note of that. I'm not really focusing on this presentation doesn't focus on getting on too much into all of your, the specific strategy. It's more of just kind of formulate a general strategy. But you also do need to have a monitoring plan within your proposal itself. So if you are proposing restoration, they're going to want to see how you're going to monitor that, and that may just be going back and reviewing the site periodic. If you do an invasive plant species removal project, having staff go back out and periodically check, let's say once a month, to make sure that nothing else is sprouting up, and that if something is, that it's going to get addressed immediately. And we have had projects in the past, the Chumash have had projects in the past where we had one particular plant called a rundo where we did remove it, and we had to go back periodically and make sure it's not regrowing. And there has been some regrowing that has needed to be addressed. And the one we just got awarded for involves going back to some of those sites that did get some regrowth and removing that and restoring that even further. They also want to see one component of the proposal is an identification of clear obtainable and quantifiable goals and performance measures that will achieve the goals and objectives of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's some additional considerations you'll want to see on page 10. They weren't really noteworthy right here. You'll need to do your budget table and a narrative, so it's not enough just to have your budget table with the numbers in it, but they want to see a justification for each budget item. You'll need to include a tribal council resolution, and it's alternatively you may be able to provide a letter from an individual with delegated tribal authority. So with the Chumash, what we've done is instead of going out and getting either a full tribal council resolution or even a business committee resolution, the chairman does have the authority to submit this type of letter approving the proposal and the project. So, and we just draft up a letter for his review and his signature. This is something you really want to note and start moving on right away, because it may take you a little while to get that signature. Some additional materials you may want to include are letters of support. I highly recommend letters of support. That is related to one of the criteria. We're going to go through the criteria in a moment. That always strengthens the proposal to have more project partners. Not only to have those project partners, but to have those letters of support which indicate the strength of their commitment to your project. So you may want to get a letter of support from the Fish and Wildlife Service that's local to you. We've actually gotten letter of support from the Ventura office in California. That's the closest office to us. That's been one of them, and they've had specific things that they were going to do on the project, like come out and do studies, wildlife and habitat studies. So, if you haven't thought of that, reach out to your local office, reach out to other agencies. The Forest Service may be willing to do something like that, the BIA. Reach out to those agencies if they're willing to do those things, to do studies or help you with their assessment. Ask them for a letter of support, ask them to estimate how much time they commit to it, and if they also, if possible, if they can quantify that value, and if they can, then you can provide that as an in-kind matching or cost share that can also strengthen your proposal. But there may be nonprofits and there may be other even for-profit businesses that may be involved in the project that you want to get letters of support for. Other attachments, resumes, contract agreements, maps, so on and so forth, photos. Most of these I think they're going to include in that 24-page limit. Some of them may not. I don't think the letters of support are, but it doesn't specifically clarify that. Our last proposal did not include the letters of support, but it did include the maps and pictures. So reach out to the project contact, your local regional one, and just ask them whether or not what you're considering including is going to be part of that 24-page limit, if that's going to be an issue for you. The SF424 I mentioned needs to get signed by the chairman. It also needs to it will have a budget figure on it, so you'll need to include that budget figure before you get it signed. In the past, this is kind of a bit of a workaround. Our chairman is not too difficult to reach and get a signature from, and there have been times where I'm pushing it, or our office has been pushing it, and so when I was with the Chumash, and so we need to submit that sometimes before we even, toward the last moment. The business committee meets on Wednesdays, and the proposal itself sometimes might be due on like a following Monday or Tuesday. So I know the Wednesday prior to the deadline is the last day I can possibly get a signature. I may not actually have the full budget completed at that point, but I do need to at least have the overall budget completed so that I can include that in the SF424 for the signature. So keep that in mind, that you'll need to have a total budget figure, and including any of the matching budget figures on the SF424, that page that's going to get signed. Okay, so the project and proposal criteria. This is what you're going to be evaluated and ranked upon. It's a 100-point scale. These are just the general categories. I'm going to go into each one very briefly. Sometimes I will include these in the document. I'll cut and paste all the sub areas that they talk about. In this instance, it's only a 12-page proposal. I can refer back to it fairly easily. So I just kind of noted which ones there are. But when you're going through this review process, kind of do a preliminary calculation. Decide, just quickly tally up consider your project, what you're proposing, and quickly tally up how many points you think you're going to get. If you know that you're not going to have any partnerships, any letters of support, or any matching funds, then you're not going to get these 5 points. So you can knock that off right off the bat. Tally that up, and then talk to your local liaison and ask him or her how many points does he think you need to get in the range of to actually be fully considered. If you're going through this process and you're at 40 points and you talk to him or her and they say you're going to need to get at least 60 points to be considered, or 70 points, ask them last year what's been the minimum points that were actually awarded funding. They may say 70 points. That's very important to know ahead of time. If you go through this just kind of your back of the napkin calculation on this, and you find that you're only reaching 50 points and you don't see any way to make up points, then I don't believe it's worth spending the time preparing a proposal on this. Okay, so let me just pull over this real quick on page 12. I mentioned some of these things a little bit before in context of a Chumash proposal. Okay, so resource benefit, and that's just focusing on what you're going to benefit in terms of fish, wildlife, and plant species and their habitat. There's a focus of ongoing research. There are priorities. So this, if you see C right here, the extent to which the project addresses fish and wildlife resource priorities identified by the tribe or other entity. So if you already have a plan that identifies particular fish, so the Chumash steelhead was was wildlife of priority, had both cultural and environmental significance. It was more of a keystone species from an environmental standpoint, and it does have cultural significance to traditional Chumash ways. That including that into the proposal itself, and as a resource that's going to benefit, is going to strengthen our proposal. And they also want to know the duration for which it's going to protect that particular fish or wildlife resource. The performance measures, and this is focused on identifying a baseline and providing measurable post-project accomplishments. You're going to need to provide something quantifiable. So this is really focused on, quantifiable things. The work plan itself, the strength of the work plan, how well organized it is. I see I'm kind of running close to the end of the time here, so I am very close to the end of the proposal or the presentation. So pretty straightforward. Make sure you have a clear work plan that includes all the elements they're asking for, and the same thing with the budget. Make sure your budget's clear and you're providing everything that they're asking for. Capacity building. They want projects that are going to increase your capacity to benefit wildlife and habitat moving forward. So to the extent that it increases the tribe's self-sufficiency, they do like to see updated development and updating of management plans, because that usually involves that's a key indicator of capacity building. And they did mention ordinances and enforcement. Training and other infrastructure are also important. And then contributions and partnerships. So the alliances, the partnerships that you build, and the extent that you're leveraging other technical and financial resources, whether that's in kind, whether that's the indirect costs that I mentioned. So go through that, see where you stand in evaluating how to move forward. Some priorities that I listed when I go through this: I would want to make sure I'm reaching out to that regional Native American liaison first and foremost to discuss project ideas and questions. Start moving on the SF424 if it's going to require time to get that signature. Preparing and getting the tribal resolution or letter signed as soon as possible. Identifying those project partners and obtaining letters of support. I tend to offer to draft those letters of support for those partners to save them time. Just tell them, draft it up. They're usually happy with that, because it means they don't have to draft, and just let them know they can make any modifications they see fit to it once you submit it. And find out their time frame too, in terms of how long they need to get a signature on this to make it legitimate and to turn it around to get it back to you in time for submission. And begin to identifying and gathering relevant data. Additional notes: I would say use the sample TWG proposal as a model for this proposal, and review the review the 2007-2011 TWG projects summary for projects similar to those that you're considering. So go back and find out what's been awarded in the past. Just scan through that document and see if there's anything that's been similar that they've awarded. If it's been awarded in the past, that's a key indicator that it's a proposal that the Fish and Wildlife Service likes to fund. And then, I would want to ask, can a PDF be submitted for electronic submission? And then what does the page limit include? So you'd want to include your specific questions in here, and then if you have any ideas that you want to discuss with the grant project officer or the hopefully it ends up being your grant project officer, but the Native American liaison. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap it up. I'll just jump down this way. Okay, so So that's the grant review process. Just to close, I want to just kind of go over some of Prosper Sustainably's services that you may be interested in to assist with this process. So we do offer grant writing services, and I do believe that if I was involved in helping you prepare a proposal, that it would increase your chances, although I do know a lot of tribes do have very capable and experienced staff. I do offer reasonably priced services. Usually do it on a fixed fee, but it's negotiable. And I want to work on something that's going to be a good investment. I mean, if you're considering, you want to make sure that whatever you're investing in the grant writing process is going to have a return that exceeds it. I provide low to no cost evaluation opportunity. So, helping you evaluate whether you want to pursue this may help you not spend a full, you don't necessarily want to spend money on preparing a proposal if it isn't a good opportunity for your tribe or your situation. Also do offer hands-on or classroom-based training. So I do, during this process, like to train different tribe staff on this. So I would actually like, after preparing a proposal for a tribe, to walk away and have staff that are more capable to prepare proposals on their own in the future. So I do try to do that capacity building. And also I will do a free preliminary phone consultation up to an hour where I will ask a lot of questions just to find out whether, I think if you're looking at a particular funding opportunity, whether I believe that's a good idea or not. So I'll offer advice for free during that phone consultation. And that's why maybe no cost evaluation, because you may go through it, talk about a specific project, and I may, I'll provide my opinion in terms of how competitive I think that's going to be and whether I believe it's a good idea to proceed or not. Prosper Sustainably does offer other services. I'm not going to go to these because we are over time right now, but you can read these and go to the website to learn a bit more. And then I also want to thank you for taking the time to attend the webinar. I hope it was valuable to you. My contact information is provided on this slide. I will be emailing each of you a copy of the presentation, a copy of the grant review template, and also a copy of the sample review that we just went through. And so now, after I answer the questions, I hope you'll take a moment to complete the brief survey. It should automatically pop up when the webinar ends. If you choose to leave, please don't close the window. Click to end the webinar, and that should bring you to the survey screen. So at this point, I'm going to go to the questions and see if there are any. So at this time, does anybody have any questions? Please type them in. And actually, I'm going to open it up if there's anybody who's on. I guess there's nobody who's actually has microphone options available, or it's not allowing me to go into discussion mode. So I'm hoping that there was no questions because I did a good job, but I invite you to ask me questions. Feel free to email me, give me a call. I'm happy to answer basic questions just to help you with a proposal. For me, it's not just about my business, it's also about helping tribes be more successful in addressing their needs. I want to see tribes restore their sites. I want to help them manage or help them either directly or indirectly manage their natural resources in more effective ways. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to end the meeting now. It should bring you to the survey site, and I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.